Okay, so Thomas Hobbes, author of the Leviathan, the next book that we'll be covering in the class. Hobbes lived from about 1588 to 1679, so he lived a long life. Obviously, a few centuries after Aquinas. We'll talk a little bit about what had changed in that time. A little bit about Hobbes's life. His father was a clergyman, a rural clergyman, but maybe not what you would be expecting from a member of the from a minister, from a member of the clergy. His father apparently was illiterate, couldn't actually read. He was apparently a rather hard drinker. He had a tendency apparently to fall asleep in church. There's a story that once he fell asleep, woke up shouting something about a card game. He got in a fight with another clergyman and beat him up and fled the county after that. That's the last that we hear of him. No one's sure what happened to him after that. So a kind of a colorful character, not very much like Hobbes. Hobbes was basically, it seems as if his uncle, who was a successful glove maker, paid for his education. So Hobbes was a member of this sort of emerging middle class at the time. Who had just enough means to pay for his education. He went to Oxford. He was educated there. He learned Greek and Latin throughout his life. He actually had learned Greek even before he went to Oxford, and did a very early translation of a play by Euripides when he was still basically very young. But educated at Oxford, but basically a member of this emerging middle class. That was sort of able. He had, his family had enough means to educate him, but not enough to he couldn't just, be a sort of an independent thinker or writer or whatever for his entire life. So he did what many people did in this situation, went to work for an aristocratic family, in Hobbes's case as a tutor. It was a very good situation for him. The person for whom he was a tutor was actually only a few years younger than him. He went on one of the things that tutors would do is accompany their charge on a great tour of Europe. So Hobbes toured the European continent. During actually took a few different trips there, met all kinds of interacted with many of the major intellectual figures of the day. There's evidence that he met Galileo. He had exchanges with Descartes, René Descartes, usually considered often called the father of modern philosophy. The written exchanges Hobbes had with him over Descartes' meditations on first philosophy were not always especially happy, and eventually not even really all that respectful, but there was still interaction. Hobbes was sort of writing, Descartes was responding. So Hobbes knew many of the major intellectual figures in Europe. Eventually he actually was a bit of an exile in Europe for some time, because things that he had published in England were sort of considered politically too controversial, and so he basically had to stay in England. It wasn't, or on the European continent, it wasn't really safe for him to return to England. Like other people we've read in this class, Hobbes faced some real persecution, some real danger to himself for the things that he thought, for publicizing his thoughts or publishing them. Eventually he returned, once he returned, had a fairly happy life in England, especially at first. Lived in London for a while, was sort of a fairly major intellectual figure there. Knew a lot of the more significant and the more well thought of intellectual figures of the day. Knew the king, was sort of maybe not a friend, but knew him personally, got on well with him apparently. Eventually, retired, died again at a fairly old age. During his life, Hobbes did all sorts of writing, translations from Greek and Latin, sometimes translations into Latin. Famous translation of Thucydides, for instance, wrote about, obviously the Leviathan is usually considered, as we'll see, it talks about all kinds of different things, but it's usually considered to be above all a work of political philosophy. But Hobbes wrote in other areas of philosophy, wrote other works of political philosophy as well, also wrote about mathematics, about science, wrote certain sort of more religious or theological works as well. So he wrote a great deal about all kinds of different things. The Leviathan is usually considered his most famous, most successful, most enduring work, and we'll be reading the beginning, where we see some of his ideas about epistemology and his famous materialism, as well as his psychological views and so on, leading into his political views. So we'll see a lot of what he thought. But again, he wrote very, very widely, had a long life, a fairly successful life as an intellectual. Again, at times he was in danger, but for the most part, he had a very, you would have to say, most people, I think most people who study him, who write about him, think that he had a pretty happy and again a fairly successful life as a writer. And so, that's sort of his life. That's sort of, the biographical background. Major things that happened in the, few centuries between Aquinas and Hobbes. Obviously, the first one was the Reformation, and this, of course, was the rise of the Protestant churches, breaking away from, what at the time was just considered the Western Christian Church, but obviously became known as the Catholic Church. This led to, obviously, new Christian churches in Northern Europe, including in England. And all kinds of religious controversy, and again, Hobbes participated in some of that. At times, Hobbes was accused. Once, even formally, there was a motion in Parliament about whether or not he should be investigated for being an atheist. It seems that Hobbes actually burned some of his papers at that point when it looked like that might happen. The bill didn't really go anywhere, but for a while it looked like it might, and Hobbes destroyed some of his papers. Some people think that that's evidence that he was an atheist, that clearly he was writing things that, if he wasn't exactly writing sort of militantly atheist things, he was writing something that he didn't want people to see. Other people say, well, look, if you were going to be investigated for something like that, you might get rid of anything that might cast any suspicion on you. It's that by itself is not evidence of guilt. We'll see some of what Hobbes says about religion and so on in the Leviathan. But basically, so Hobbes was at times accused of atheism a couple of different times. That seemed to be a reputation that followed him around for a good part of his life, especially later in life. But so there were all kinds of religious controversies coming out of the Reformation, and also obviously just a very different situation than what Aquinas was dealing with in terms of the relationship between reason and religion, politics and religion, and so on. Though what is recognizable as Thomism, as basically the ideas that Thomas Aquinas promoted, in many cases came up with and argued for, and so on, we can see that influence in England at the time, and we can see it in the Leviathan as Hobbes sort of argues against it. The break between the intellectual break, especially between between England and say Germany, between the intellectual break between the Church of England and the Catholic Church, much less deep and much less radical than the one between the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church. So you can still see a lot of Aquinas' influence in these ideas that Hobbes is arguing against. What he says are taught in the schools, in other words, the universities of the day. The universities were kind of established. They were teaching people, and Hobbes is very critical of what they're teaching them. And this is the other major change, along with the Reformation, but in many ways maybe even more significant, and maybe more significant for understanding Hobbes, the Enlightenment. This major change that happens in European society at this time. During Hobbes' life, it's still fairly early, but the basic idea of the Enlightenment, I mean, there are all kinds of different famous descriptions of it, different famous definitions that were given. The basic idea, in many ways, you can kind of define the Enlightenment in terms of oppositions between, say, reason and superstition. And it becomes more and more radical as it goes on, so that by the time you're in the 18th century, and you have people like Voltaire who are quite critical of religion. In Hobbes' day, it wasn't nearly as much of sort of reason versus religion, though we'll see again how critical he is of religion while allowing that Christianity is an exception. But the basic idea of the Enlightenment is that reason should be left to itself, and should be able to explore things. Reason, science, but also philosophy should be able to explore things on its own terms, and that religion should not be limiting what science can say, or trying to compel science or reason to come to certain conclusions. So there was a debate, for instance, what's the center of the universe, the Earth, or something else? That was obviously religion said one thing, science said another. Science said it looks like the Earth is not the center of the universe. Religion said yes, it is, and so that was an example of sort of a sort of Enlightenment era conflict between reason or science on the one hand, and religion and religious authority on the other. And we'll see how Hobbes is again not quite as radical or not quite as militant as some people who would come later, but we'll see how he sort of has some of these ideas, how he sort of expresses some of them, how it clearly is informing part of what he's saying and what he's doing in the Leviathan, as he's critical of certain forms of teaching that prevail in the universities, critical at times of priests, critical of all of this. In fact, the entire last part of the Leviathan is called the Kingdom of Darkness, and it's about darkness coming from false religion and also philosophy, but a lot of it is obviously critical what he thinks is misinterpretations of religion. So again, this whole idea of the Enlightenment, this whole idea of European society really changing, and the idea being that basically sort of the beginning of arguments for a secular society in which reason and science and things like that provide the real source of authority, the real source of at least common beliefs and common justification, public justifications for things should be based not on religious authority but on reason and on science and so on. And we see some of this. We'll be able to see how Hobbes advances some of this. In terms of the contrast with Aquinas in particular, we'll see Hobbes very impressed by, again, he's a materialist. When we get to the introduction, basically the second sentence of the introduction starts talking about Hobbes' view of materialism, that, as he puts it, life is just limbs in motion, matter in motion. But basically, more generally, he sees life, remember, Aquinas basically saw everything as acting for a particular purpose or a particular end. So this idea of teleology. For Aquinas, human beings have a natural end. It is, as we saw, to know the truth about God, to seek a particular good that is proper to human beings as human beings. And he says, for Aquinas, animals are doing the same thing. They're pursuing their ends. And even, remember the fifth way from the five ways, the arguments from governance of the world, the idea is that things that lack intelligence, so animals, but also plants, even just inanimate physical nature, Aquinas said everything acts for an end, and it's acting for a particular purpose. And that's how you explain the actions of things in nature, whether they're physical or animal or human beings or whatever. That's how you understand it, is they're all acting for a particular end or purpose. Hobbes says the exact opposite. Hobbes says that what you see in the physical world certainly is impersonal principles of impersonal laws of physics which control the physical motions of the world. And he says, and human beings are the same way. Human beings are also matter. Human beings are also physical objects, which are also controlled by these same impersonal laws, these same impersonal principles of physics. And that explains all sorts of things about human thought, human action, and so on. And therefore, Hobbes says there is no ultimate end for human beings. There is no, as he puts it, summum bonum. There is no ultimate good or final happiness for human beings. So in rejecting a lot of this sort of medieval Aristotelian Thomist physics, he also rejects all of this Thomist idea about human teleology. And therefore, Hobbes says life is just a series of continual change from one desire to the next. When you get something that you want, it's simply the means to something beyond that. Hobbes says, again, there is no ultimate good, no greatest good, no ultimate end or happiness for human life. Human life is essentially, without any particular goal or purpose. And we'll see, we'll see much more of this as we go on, as we get into the Leviathan. But this is one of the major differences between Aquinas and Hobbes, and something that we'll come back to in a couple of places, because it is so fundamental in this entirely new, in many ways very revolutionary picture of people that Hobbes presents and argues for.